Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this very important webinar on the California Assembly Bill 5. We have a great panel today, but we'd like to also thank our sponsors. Transact is bringing you this webinar in conjunction with CSCMP and Knit League, and I'd like to ask Mark Baxa from Knit League to introduce himself.
Or from CSCMP.
Okay, I'm really awake this morning.
Mark, you changed.
Mark.
Yeah, I changed. Collaboration.
You can let the news out now.
Moves at a high rate of speed. No, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Gail, certainly for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to bring this very important topic with the sponsorship of and support of you, Mike, and your leadership in this very important part of our era of transportation that we're all facing. CSCMP is an organization that stands for the advancement and enhancement of the supply chain profession, no matter where you're a student all the way through your retirement years, where an opportunity exists to give back. We are a global organization, and we care much about the things that affect the supply chain and its fluidity, specifically during this very important time when we're all facing so many different constraints that seem uncontrollable. So today's topic is extremely hot, and I'm happy to be a part of this and to invite our members and guests of CSCMP to be a part of this as well, and in collaboration with Transact. And Gail, thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here and to help support what matters most to our members. I'd like to introduce Nancy Olidi from Knit League, and Nancy, take it away.
Thanks. Knit League is pleased to be part of the webinar with Transact and CSCMP, as the issue of AB5 will affect everyone in the supply chain. Knit League has been the voice of the shipper since 1907, and these past couple of years have given Knit League many opportunities to be the shipper's voice and fight for a competitive supply chain, whether you're moving freight by rail, ocean, or the highway. Knit League will continue to work with FMC through the rulemakings on OSRA, the Surface Transportation Board on EP 711, and a plethora of other issues facing the lack of rail service, which will be crucial if we take more drivers and trucks off the road. And today, as you know, we're going to discuss AB5. Hopefully everyone will pay attention to how this is going to affect us, especially since we're having so much trouble with rail. Mike, I'd like to introduce you. I know you don't really need to be introduced, but Mike Regan, who we've put this together, invited a great group of people to speak. So take it away, Mike.
Great. Thank you so much, Gail. And I just want to start off, folks, by saying this is a big deal. And I didn't realize how big a deal this was until our good friend Jeff Brashears, everyone knows Jeff, sent me a notice saying this is beyond big because you're hosting a webcast during lunch hour on National Hot Dog Day. And folks, it doesn't get much bigger than that, but on a very serious vein, there are some huge things that are going on in the transportation industry. And at the top of that list is AB5 and the ongoing negotiations between the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union and the Pacific Maritime Association. They are operating without a contract, and it has some very significant impact. And I want to emphasize that these are just two of the issues. Were we to have more time, there are some other huge issues floating around out there that represent a direct threat to your transportation and freight costs, as well as your supply chain operations. There are things like Nancy briefly mentioned, the service issues on the rail front. Saw recently a memo from a executive VP of one of the Class 1 railroads out to a salesperson who shared it with one of the customers. Folks, it's serious. The rails are operating without a contract. The president has invoked the Emergency Board Act, potentially 2 30-day cooling off periods. We could see something happen in the middle of September. We're hoping not. We also have the Uyghur Safety Protection Act. And what's interesting to me is a lot of you have no idea what AB5 is about. You have no idea what the Uyghur Safety Protection Act is, but it has issues that do affect your supply chain. Karen is, I'm going to introduce here shortly our panel, is with Thompson Hine. They are hosting a special webcast on July 26th on the Uyghur Safety Protection Act. If you have goods coming in from China, this is a big deal. But having said that, today we're going to focus on, like I said, AB5 and the ongoing port negotiations. Let me briefly introduce who you're going to be hearing from. because the thing I love about this webcast, I don't have a single PowerPoint for you. There isn't a single slide. Isn't that great? But we do have some great content. And so the more you hear from me, the less you hear from these resources. Karen Booth is a partner at Thompson Hine and in charge of their transportation practice. It's been my privilege and pleasure to work with Karen, both at the Knit League and NASTRAC, as the chair of the Advocacy Council. Thompson Hine is a spectacular firm doing great work on the transportation front. Matt Schrapp is the head of the Harbor Transportation Association, and he is out on the forefront there. On our precast web call, he was sharing stuff with me that I was like, holy cow, this is not stuff you're seeing in the print, in the press. And then we have our good friend Peter Tershwell, who is the VP at IHS Markit, the Journal of Commerce, and is responsible for that publication. Is probably one of the foremost informed individuals on the ocean front. JOC sponsors the TPM conference in March, as well as the Inland Marine Conference that I'll be speaking at in the fall. You're going to get an update on some of the things that are going on. So having said all that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Karen, who's going to update you on what the heck AB5 really is. Karen, take it away.
Mike, thanks so much. It really is a pleasure to be with you and everybody this afternoon, at least on the East Coast, to discuss this important issue. You know, typically the lawyers come in last to do cleanup, but I think with AB5, there's a lot of complicated issues wrapped up in some of the legal parameters. And so lucky me, I'm going to go first today. And let me just, as Mike said, I'm a partner and chair of the transportation practice at Thompson Hine. It's also my pleasure to be general counsel to Knit League. I've done work with CSCMP, and I certainly know the others on this panel. So great to be with my friends and colleagues here. The other thing about, I guess, my practice and Thompson Hine that associates us with AB5 is that we did prepare an amicus brief in the court. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about an update on the legal issues for a group of associations, including Knit League and CSCMP, before the Ninth Circuit and before the Supreme Court in support of the trucking industry on this issues. So shippers, the customers of the trucking industry, have been very much aligned with the trucking industry in, frankly, trying to get this law not to be enforced against the motor carrier industry, but that unfortunately is not where we ended up. So what I want to cover in just some of my brief remarks is, as Mike asked, you know, what is California AB5? I'll give you a brief update on the legal proceedings and where things stand, and then leave you with some words, I guess, of the implications for motor carriers and shippers with respect to this law. I'm happy to take any questions you may have. So what is AB5? AB5 is a California state law governing whether a worker is classified as an independent contractor or an employee. Now, this law took effect in California in January of 2020, except in cases where legal proceedings were instituted and stays or injunctions were put in place. And that did happen for the motor carrier industry. So this is a general labor law. It's not a law that applies only to the motor carrier industry. Rather, it's much broader than that. And it does include a number of exceptions for certain industries and types of workers. But the key thing about AB5 that you need to understand is that it has a three-part test known as the ABC test. And to be an independent contractor under this law, and again, it's a California law, a worker has to satisfy all three parts of the test. Now, the California legislature didn't make this up out of thin air. It actually got this idea from the California Supreme Court. But I want to address now, what is the test? What do you need to know? How do you apply this law to your business? So 3 parts again to the test. You have to meet all 3 parts to be an independent contractor in California. Part A, the worker is free from the control and direction of the hiring entity. So if a motor carrier hires an independent owner operator, that motor carrier cannot control to a significant degree how that hiring entity performs its services, both as a contractual matter and a factual matter. That's not really the problem here. That's a test that's been in effect in many states. Prong B, The worker and the independent contractor here has to perform work outside of the usual course of the hiring entity's business. So if a retail business hires a plumber, they're not in the same business. But guess what, folks? If a motor carrier hires an independent trucker, they're in the same business. And that is the problem, prong B. Prong C, the worker is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business. And this is also not a real problem, but I'll tell you what they're getting at here. This is really aimed at exclusive arrangements where an independent contractor may contract with a single hiring entity. This law doesn't really like that. It wants to see independent contractors be a business that's independent, that holds itself out to the public at large, and solicits business from multiple hiring entities. So AB5, as I said at the beginning, is a general labor law. It applies to many industries, but it absolutely now applies to the motor carrier industry. And that means that the relationship between independent owner operators and their carriers, their brokers and their shippers are now governed by this ABC test. Independent truckers who perform work in the same industry as the hiring motor carrier fail prong B, and that means they would be classified as an employee under California law. There's exceptions for professional services. There's also a business-to-business exception I'm going to talk about in a minute that some argue isn't really fair. Why have they accepted certain industries that tend to be more professional services and not the motor carrier industry? That's a fight for a day that we're going to frankly be having very soon. So with respect to the legal challenges with AB5 and where it stands, the California Trucking Associations challenged this law in federal court in California. And they sought to enjoin its enforcement against the motor carrier industry, arguing it was preempted under federal law. Because federal law prohibits any state, including California, from adopting a law that regulates trucking rates, routes, and services. The U.S. federal court in California at the lower level agreed with CTA. They found AB5 should be preempted under federal law. They felt that it indirectly regulated trucking services and routes, and that irreparable harm would occur to this industry, primarily the owner operators. The state of California appealed that decision to the Ninth Circuit, who reversed the district court in April of 2021. The Ninth Circuit found that AB5 is a general labor law and that the business-to-business exception could apply to some motor carriers, and they therefore struck down that injunction. CTA appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and as I mentioned at the beginning, Knit League, CSCMP, and others, filed briefs supporting the trucking industry, asking the Supreme Court, take this case. It's a big deal. There's splits in the circuits. This is going to disrupt interstate commerce if you allow this law to take effect in California. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decided, without any opinion, we don't know what the votes were amongst the justices, to deny CTA's petition. And that meant that once that happened on June 30th, obviously a very short time ago, the Ninth Circuit issued its mandate the next day, meaning that its prior ruling striking down that injunction now takes effect, and AB5 becomes applicable to the motor carrier industry. So what does this mean? It's got a number of implications, obviously, for motor carriers as well as their customers. Companies who hire independent truckers in California now must comply with AB5. This creates a compliance risk for the hiring entity under California labor laws and tax laws, as independent drivers are now classified as employees. They become subject to California wage, benefits, and tax laws. The motor carrier industry has relied on independent truckers to meet fluctuating service demands for decades, and many independent truckers prefer to be business owners and not employees. So what does this mean? And I think obviously Matt is going to be in the best position to speak to this, but it seems clear that motor carriers are facing a need to evaluate the structure of their operations. Are they going to have to hire now drivers as employees? What capital investments do they need to make if they were relying upon owner-operator equipment? They're now dealing with compliance risks, and all of this translates to dollar signs, higher costs. If independent operators choose to leave the California market and or the industry altogether and say, the heck with trucking, now we've got capacity problems that are only going to add to the serious supply chain disruptions already occurring, especially in California, if capacity is further reduced. As I mentioned, rising costs for carriers typically means rising costs for their customers. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty here, as this is all just happening in the last few weeks around, are motor carriers compliant? When do they have to comply? I know there's some questions around the effective date. I think some of this can be addressed contractually, but it's a bit of a mess. There's confusion around interstate moves. If you originate a move outside of California, where the driver is an independent contractor in another state, and then they enter California and suddenly become an employee, what does that mean? How do you deal with that? Lots of complications, lots of issues. There also are lots of concerns about, as I said, disruption to interstate commerce, because other states were considering adopting similar laws to AB5. Massachusetts, I think New Jersey, possibly New York, but they were waiting for the Supreme Court to make its decision. What we don't know is if these states are now going to move forward, and there could be others to adopt similar laws. And now you can think about what we call in the legal world as a patchwork of regulation, where you're classified as an independent contractor in one state and an employee in another. And you can only think of the disruption that this could create, as well as a lot of confusion and complications. So really, to wrap up my remarks, because I'm hoping that we're going to get some questions, I'd certainly be very happy to address those. It's a very unfortunate day that the Supreme Court declined to review this case, leading to massive uncertainty and disruption at a time when unprecedented supply chain disruptions are already occurring, especially in California. I will say, however, there is at least a chance for another challenge of this law, because the law was challenged very early, before it could really take effect. And it was a preliminary injunction before the impacts on the industry were clear. The impacts were alleged to have occurred by, of course, truckers and their customers and others. So once this law takes effect and the impacts become more well known, there's at least a possibility of another challenge at that time. I also mentioned earlier on, there is a business-to-business exception to AB5, although there's a lot of questions about whether any motor carriers could meet that exception. We're not going to have time to get into the weeds of that here, but I think maybe some could and some could not. But I think the real issue is that it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. Once you force motor carriers to restructure their operation and really kind of do things in a different way and get all ramped up and hire lawyers and figure out the compliance and all the paperwork, it does become very difficult, as I said, to put the genie back in the bottle and revert back. So what we've got here is a bit of a mess. I'm sorry to leave you on a bit of a sour note, but that's where we are. And, I like to have more answers than questions, but this is all really unfolding before our eyes. I think Matt can, the trade press has been very clear about protests and industry groups who want the governor to make changes. This may lead to more advocacy, which of course brings in Knit League, CSCMP, JOC, Matt's group, and others to come together and figure out how to address this. So with that, thank you very much. Let me turn it over to Matt. And again, happy to answer questions.
Before going there, Matt, if I could just interject something. Mark and Nancy have been very gracious. We joked about this, but for those that sign up for CSCMP or Knit League, when you're done with this call, we'll send you a week's worth of Xanax, because one of the things that you're
We might have lost Mike.
We lost Mike.
Yeah, Matt, I think over to you. I think you could just go ahead and pick up, where I left off.
Yeah, and that's a good transition for me. Anytime that folks are speaking about sending out samples of a pharmaceutical in order to help ease some of the depression and uncertainty that we all experience. We all know that's going to be brought by a truck. So either way, no matter what, the impacts are felt throughout the supply chain. And Karen, thank you very much for that very thoughtful overview of the of AB5 and how these uncertainties are really playing into some of the challenges we're experiencing out here in California. My name is Matt Schrapp. I'm the CEO of the Harbor Trucking Association. We are a coalition, a nonprofit coalition of intermodal and drayage carriers doing business on the West Coast of the United States. So we have carrier members who do operations from San Diego all the way up to Seattle, Tacoma. Obviously, our main focus and issues are in the great state of California, AB5 just being one of them. I can tell you that as the development of AB5, which was on the heels of the Dynamex case that Karen mentioned, during its development, ourselves and our motor carrier members, as well as the California Trucking Association, who is really leading the charge on the discussions with the author's office, with the governor's office. Subsequently, we're the ones who carried the torch all the way to the Supreme Court. Throughout all of those discussions, one thing was very clear that we reiterated repeatedly to anyone who would listen, is that these independent drivers do not want to be employees. And as Karen alluded to, the only pathway really to ensure that you're not violating AB5, the ABC test, or even the business to business provision is the fact that you have employee drivers. And the challenge becomes convincing folks who have been operating under a business structure for the past 40 years, ever since deregulation, basically, that these men and women are no longer able to operate in the way that they've become accustomed to, the same way that they've been able to provide for their families, etc. So last week, we saw this on display very clearly. LA Long Beach saw protests starting on Wednesday, moving through Friday and into the weekend a little bit, where more effectively truckers were blocking entrances to marine terminals, disrupting operations and causing some reverberations throughout the rest of the supply chain. This week, protests started up in Oakland, and I can tell you as of yesterday, more or less the entire port of Oakland was shut down. You even have ILWU getting into the protests and not crossing their lines due to health and safety concerns, which just basically caused marine terminals to not open their gates or service trucks. So this is having impacts already. And when we think about how profound the impacts of AB5 actually are, I think it goes to the point of Karen's reference to this patchwork of regulatory policy. In 1993, when the Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Act, better known as the F4A or F Quad A, was passed, was specifically to prevent a patchwork of regulatory policy for motor carriers engaged in interstate commerce. Most of us who were tracking the case throughout its life thought that preemption was very clear, that you'd have to be blind to really see how this was not going to impact the routes, rates, and services of motor carriers, and beyond that, how it would disrupt the overall goods movement interstate commerce system, which we are clearly seeing just through these trucker protests. We're talking a few hundred drivers and trucks that are out there disrupting this. There are thousands that will be impacted by this in California. And if they were to stop, so to speak, or create some more chaos, if you will, within marine terminals or at other locations, we could see a crippling of the supply chain here in California. And as California is the gateway to the United States with close to 40% of all goods coming through LA Long Beach, the effects would be felt again throughout the supply chain. And for us, I think that it's important that we continue to recognize how critical the need is for some level of clarity. The problem mainly is that, as Karen alluded to, the ABC test, while it's relatively clear that you can't be in the same business as the hiring or contracting entity that you're under contract with, the business to business exemption, and without getting into the weeds, creates a tremendous amount of challenges for those who would want to remain independent. Throughout the process, you had the author's office, the governor's office, the solicitor general's office, the Ninth Circuit, all pointing to this business to business exemption, saying that, well, this exists, so it still provides a pathway for independence. Not true. there is so much ambiguity within the business to business that you cannot say with certainty that an entity would not be facing potential legal action, even if they were attempting to meet all of the 11 points. And it's not a pick as you choose. It is, you need to meet all 11 in order to be exempted from the B prong. We have some motor carriers who are looking at what's called a brokerage settlement carrier model using brokerages. Also very unclear in how that's going to be applied. Ourselves, with the leadership of the California Trucking Association, our partner organization out here in California, had sent a letter to the governor's office. It was ourselves as well as 70 other trade associations asking specifically for clarity in how this was going to be enforced. First off, to ask for a brief stay of enforcement, and then second off, to have a roundtable discussion with labor as well as the governor's office and the varying agencies that would be enforcing this, And so far, we have not received any response from the governor's office. The only responses that we've seen have come through the media, which basically is encompassing this concept that the rule has been on the books for 2 years and people have plenty of time to plan for it. And now they can start expecting enforcement actions. And one thing that throws another wrench into the works here is the fact that despite the ability of the state to potentially issue a stay of enforcement, you have these, as I like to call them, the container chasing attorneys out there who are convincing drivers that they will be getting tens of thousands of dollars in back wages. And the only people who make money in those circumstances are typically the lawyers. All due respect to Karen and her profession, obviously there's a need for legal counsel across the board. But in these plaintiffs' private right of actions, we've seen over the years for misclassification, this potentially put companies completely out of business. So we have a two-prong attack here, potentially on the industry. One being the official enforcement position from the state of California, the other being, again, this private right of action, which is just creating a massive amount of uncertainty. And the drivers, again, it's not like they would be punished for trying to maintain their independence. It would be the companies that they work for. And so as we see this boiling up to the service, along with the eventual end of the year legacy standards here in California for ARB, that's the Air Resources Board in use diesel engine requirements that will be going into effect at the end of this year, impacting about 25% of full gate moves at LA Long Beach and in Oakland. We would see potentially even more of a crunch in the supply chain emanating from California. And if there's anyone out there who thinks that California is not the bleeding edge of regulatory policy, we can point to several other rules that other states have adopted over the years to emulate exactly what California has been doing, for better or worse. And I'll keep my comments to that, and I hope that there'll be some questions that come up. I will say in closing here that although that this was a law of general applicability, which has also been alluded to many times by the supporters of the bill, it's probably the only law of general applicability that has over 100 exemptions for varying professions. And while the gig economy of rideshare, that being Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, etc., while it was utilized, I think, from a talking point standpoint for the national news media, that everybody and their uncle knew that the rideshare folks would be spending themselves right out of compliance with this bill, which is exactly what they did with Prop 22. While unfortunately for them, the proposition had been overturned, they're currently appealing it. But at the end of the day, we've all known that this was specifically targeted at the trucking industry. It's always been about the trucking industry, especially port drayage, which is something that the Teamsters, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, have been going after to organize for decades now. And with the statements coming from the Labor Federation in Los Angeles, as well as some local Teamster divisions in California, is that companies better get ready because this is going to start being enforced. So if that's not a threat, I haven't heard one, I don't think, that I would recognize. So again, looking forward to some positive feedback here from the group and some great discussion. Please don't be shy about asking questions. There's no such thing as a bad one. Our main answer typically to motor carriers is call a lawyer, because there's way too much uncertainty here. So I appreciate the opportunity to chat. And Mike, I don't know if you want to hand it over to Peter now to round out the discussion, or if we have another pathway, but I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to further discussions.
Matt, before we switch over to Peter, I think Mike is still trying to get connected
No,
here.
I'm on, Gail. I
okay.
apologize.
Cool.
We had Putin, the Chinese, North Koreans all sabotage my machine to keep this vitally important information to getting into the hands of shippers. But let me just ask a couple of questions, Matt, because we do have some that came in ahead of time. I said in the invite, and the reason this is an emergency broadcast, and Knit League and CSCMP jumped on the bandwagon. I sit on the board of a publicly traded truckload carrier. We're one of the largest drayage agents. And, the Harbor Trucking Association, not transportation, but the Trucking Association is a great group. Was I being extreme when I said drayage rates could go up by as much as 25 to 50%?
I think that might be conservative. Again, if you need to flip the
Okay.
script on your entire operations, especially moving from non-asset based to asset based, you're talking potentially 100% cost increase when you look at.
Wait.
maintenance of the equipment,
I
essentially.
want to make sure this Xanax moment sinks in. For everybody on this call, you're a shipper. You have stuff coming in from China or Vietnam, you're coming into the West Coast ports, California ports. You could see your drayage rates go up by as much as 100%.
Well, costs for motor carriers would be going up 100%. How that translates into increased costs for their customers remains to be seen. Obviously, as a nonprofit trade association, we don't get into rates discussions, but suffice it to say, just on its face, if I'm currently not running or owning and maintaining my own trucks, while I do take responsibility for the safety of those vehicles and those drivers who are leased to my motor carrier authority, that if I am moving now to a fully 100% asset-based fleets where I'm paying the workman's comp, I'm paying the unemployment insurance, I'm paying Social Security, Medicare contributions, providing benefits, etc., your costs can skyrocket. And I've heard estimates of being 100% cost increase for operational considerations for a motor carrier. Again, that 100% might not translate directly to what a rate increase could be, but suffice it to say, these increased costs are going to have to be absorbed somewhere.
Okay, second question being, you have 70,000 drivers that are owner operators, okay? And they, shut down the Port of Oakland yesterday. They got some notoriety there with the protest. If you see a massive exodus of truck drivers, I know Peter could potentially talk about this because we've seen an increase in dwell times and detention and demurrage. I know no one on this call has any detention and demurrage issues. We could talk about how Knit League, under Karen's guidance, we addressed that with Azra, but could we see a deterioration in service levels at the West Coast ports if we see 20, 30,000 drivers leave the market?
There's always that potential. Absolutely. There's no way that you can make up that level of capacity loss overnight. And whether or not the remaining motor carriers can fill that gap remains to be seen. So I would think that removal of 30% of the marketplace would definitely have an impact on capacity.
Yeah, let me help you out. They can't fulfill the gap, okay? But the third and final thing is, and I shouldn't be laughing about this, but I think it is absolutely crucial that Nancy and the Knit League are all over this. Representative Levin from Michigan, representing the 11th Congressional District in Michigan, thinks it's a great idea if this AB5 becomes part of the PRO Act, which would basically bring it into federal legislation. And that is something we need to make people aware of. And Mark, you brought up the fact that, and as has Karen and Matt, we have uncertainty, confusion, potential disruptions. And that speaks to the issue that I would just raise for everybody. Do you have a written supply chain plan or a written transportation spend management plan? I'm going to help you out. I've given this presentation to thousands of people. Probably fewer than 20% of you on this call have a written transportation or supply chain plan. And that begs the question, if you don't have a plan, humor me and tell me what your contingency plan looks like if your drayage rates go up through the roof, if your detention and demurrage charges continue to be obscenely high, and it costs a bunch more money and has all sorts of inventory cash conversion impacts. And with that cheerful note, I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who's going to tell us why the port negotiations are going swimmingly well and why shippers have nothing to be concerned about with the ILWU and the BMA. So Peter, take it away.
Thanks, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. It's very interesting that there was a little bit of an intersection of the longshoremen and the trucker protests, Matt, as you had alluded to in Oakland. A really interesting question is exactly why it was that the longshoremen chose to support the truckers. These are not exactly unionized truckers. In fact, you could argue that actually one of the things that they're protesting about is to have to avoid joining a union and to remain independent. So one of the questions that we're asking is this a surreptitious stealth local protest by dock workers in Oakland, somehow tied to the negotiations? Remember, if we go back to 2014 and 2015, during the last full-fledged longshore labor negotiation on the West Coast, why was it that there was 6 months of disruption that forced President Obama to send his labor secretary, Tom Perez, out to the West Coast to knock heads together and get a deal? That was not because that it was a top-down directive from the leadership of the ILWU to the locals to disrupt the ports in hopes of gaining leverage at the big table negotiations. Rather, it was local units of the ILWU in Oakland, in the PNW, and in Southern California, all expressing through actions grievances related to specific issues that they had. We know going into the negotiations this year that there are local issues. They remain. There are unresolved issues at the local level. We know, for example, that the ILWU dock workers up in Seattle are still very displeased at how the resolution of SSA supporting the machinist union for maintenance and repair jobs at the T5 terminal. That's the type of local granular issue that in the past has been a flashpoint that could affect the coast-wide negotiations. So this was my piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. I wrote about exactly this subject. We don't know how it's going to turn out. At the same time, we did do a straw poll about a week and a half ago, touching base with all of the people who we know and who we are regularly in contact with, who really have their finger on the pulse of these negotiations. We found that group to be surprisingly optimistic, actually, more so than we thought they would be, basically saying that whereas Obama had waited months to get involved in ultimately in 2015, the Biden administration, which does not want to see any more port disruption because of the connection to inflation, how inflation is a political liability for him heading into the midterms, they are all over these negotiations. The Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, we understand, is in almost daily contact with the various parties, as is the port envoy. They do not want to let anything get out of control, and they are trying to guide these negotiations in the direction of a successful conclusion. That meaning a deal gets done, perhaps as early as next month or September, which would actually be relatively early if it happened. But some of the participants are mentioning the possibility for a deal that early in the process. And then a deal gets done, and there is a much less risk of labor disruption on West Coast ports for BCOs who are trying to run their supply chains. So I think Mike, I think that those who are closely following these negotiations remain on pins and needles. There has not been a negotiation going back to the 1990s that has not been accompanied by some disruption. And we went back and we did the research, and we know that there were instances of disruption tied to every negotiation going back to the 1990s, some worse than others. Ironically, the 2008 negotiation, which was when the employers, that being the marine terminal operators on the West Coast, gained the right to automate. This is how TRAPAC was automated. It was the reason why LBCT in Long Beach was automated. It was why APMT was automated. It's why TTI is going through the beginnings of an automation process, while there are other terminals that are also considering going down this road, all because of the right to automate that was granted to the employers in 2008. And it turned out that of all the negotiations that have occurred since the early 1990s, 2008 was arguably the one where there was the least disruption. And now automation is one of the major points of contention at the negotiating table, and one of the reasons why there still is, considerable nervousness about how this is going to play out, even if various parties close to the talks are beginning to be optimistic, which we reported in the JOC last week. We wanted to let the market know that we were hearing that the sentiment is obviously we're not out of the woods by any means yet, but that there's generally a comfort level potentially setting in here that Biden and his team are not going to allow things to get out of control, and that ultimately we're going to get a deal without the West Coast blowing up the way it did in 2015.
Okay, I've got 3 questions, Pete, that have come in, Peter, and Matt, you may want to mention this. The Port of Long Beach, I believe Matt mentioned that in June, they set a record for containers moved. The Port of LA, Gene Soroka has been very adamant about the fact that operations are continuing, as usual, that we are not seeing the kind of, the East Coast ports are jammed up, Savannah, Charleston, Newark, and so there's not like a lot of options. But one of the questions that has come up is, at what point in time should shippers get really, really nervous about the potential impact from AB5 or complications associated with the port negotiations? If we don't have a contract here, Peter, middle of August, end of August, do we start to get a little bit nervous about, the flow through of ports? We're also, you guys have done a great job of covering why peak season issues are no longer what they used to be. And so Matt, Peter, help us out. At what point in time do we start to see all this stuff hit shippers' budgets and supply chains? Peter, you want to take a stab first, and then I'll throw it over to Matt.
Well, there's a lot of sort of uncertainty as to where we're really at right now. There's a very dramatic contrast right now between what's happening at origin and what's happening at destination. In North America right now, you're seeing, really historic rail backlogs, rail bottlenecks. You're seeing historic levels of vessels waiting outside East Coast ports and Gulf Coast ports. You're seeing, hundreds of thousands of containers totally idled, sitting outside ports, on ships, sitting on marine terminals, sitting at railheads and in the parking lots of distribution centers, unopened with merchandise, with goods, mostly consumer goods. And at the same time, you go back to Asia, and what do you see there? Containers are freely available. We reported this yesterday. Doesn't matter how many containers are idled or slowed down in terms of their circulatory movement back in North America and Europe, by the way. They're freely available in Europe. Freight rates are headed down. There is space on ships. The environment between shippers and carriers has completely changed, where shippers are now chomping at the bit to reach out to their ocean carriers to renegotiate contracts lower. Not all shippers are interested in doing this, but a lot of them are. Not all carriers are interested in negotiating, but some of them are. Nevertheless, the environment has changed completely. So that kind of anticipates the possibility of a weaker peak season than was anticipated, and also the fact that there was no massive bounce after the Shanghai lockdown certainly seemed to point to erosion of growth and erosion of demand. Factory orders being canceled, that kind of thing. So the pressures on the supply chain are easing, actually, and you now are starting to hear people begin to say with some degree of conviction that actually once all this inventory sort of flushes through the system here in North America, that actually you might actually see the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of some kind of reversion or to pre-pandemic normalcy.
So Peter, you mentioned something, and I think it's important for the audience to hear this. The good news is container, shipping, the rates for ocean shipments, a year ago, 15, 18, 20, 25,000 now are in the 6 to 8, 10,000 with some of the spot rates. We've had an inversion. So that's good news. We do want to emphasize that. The second thing I want to highlight is this week in our 2-minute warning, we're releasing our semi-annual interview with noted economist Gary Schilling. And Gary highlighted the fact that while there's an organization that officially declares a recession, it has not been officially declared. Gary said that we're about as close to a recession. So that may be causing some of the relief that you're talking about. And we'll have that interview available for people. Matt, with respect to the drayage, I do want to circle back. At what point in time do we see any calming of detention or demurrage or, drayage issues, or does it get worse? And if so, when?
Well, I feel the light at the end of the tunnel that we're looking at is a train headed right at us at this point in time. So
so much for the good news.
Right. Yeah, I'm the bearer of bad news, unfortunately. And there's just so much uncertainty right now in our industry that it's difficult to pin down any specifics. So I think that for shippers, having conversations with their motor carrier partners or with their brokerage partners or 3PL partners in how exactly they're going to strategize a compliance pathway for AB5, for the ARB. I mean, pick your acronym out here in California, unfortunately. So I think that having that diligence in engaging early, as in right now, with those motor carrier groups, again, 3PL, broker, what have you, and what type of truck power is available, what type of structure, if you will, is being applied to that particular truck, should hopefully give some comfort into how folks are going to be meeting these standards. I think that for us, we have every business model under the sun. We have employee companies, we have union Teamster companies. I mean, we have the largest Teamster employer in the world as being a member of HTA. I'll give you guys a guess of who that might be. And we can, for certain say that there are companies out there who are prepared for this. Now, the problem is the level of capacity, because if we're still on course from what LA Long Beach says to breaking the records that were put last year, we're already on pace to eclipse, not majorly, but to have more TEUs handled at LA Long Beach than we were last year, which was the record-setting year of 20 million TEUs handled through the complex. That cargo is not going to stop flowing. As Peter had alluded to, there might be some dips depending on locality. But for us in California, a truck has to move this equipment. There's not enough on dock rail. We have this issue with the rail right now and their long dwelling containers. So if we see a capacity crunch, we're going to see an issue. So having those conversations now, I think, although perhaps cold comfort, it might provide a little bit of help in getting people to understand what these impacts might be to their own supply chains.
And the other issue, and while I was frozen there, I trust you updated folks on when you say ARB, the California Air Resource Board, effective January 1st, will have a more stringent requirement about what trucks can enter the ports. Is it engines that are newer than 2014, or is that it?
Yeah, the state doesn't like to make anything simple. So statewide, it's 2010 engine standards, but for LA Long Beach, if you're a first-time VIN entrant, at least leading up to 2024, you have to be 2014 truck model year. So a little bit of confusion there. If you're currently in the DTR with the 2010 or later engine, you'll be okay. But for those folks who aren't, which is about 4,300, I think was the last number that I saw, who are active in service vehicles in LA Long Beach out of about 5,800 that are registered to do business, still equates to about 25% of full container moves being handled by that vintage, which effectively will be removed overnight as it sits right now.
So let me see if I have this right. And, Mark and Nancy, I might be off base on this. I have fewer trucks, fewer drivers. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's not good, Peter. Oh, anyway, I don't mean to make light of this, but folks, you have to be able to smile through this. I do have a question for Nancy, and that is Joe asked how a state law can apply to interstate movements. Is that not a conflict with the Constitution? Are imports entering California but bound for other states exempt from this law?
Was that for Nancy or for Karen? But
No, that's for you.
Karen.
No,
Okay.
that's for Karen.
okay. That was what all the litigation was all about. And honestly, we thought a strong case, Matt thought a strong case, others thought a strong case for federal preemption. The F4A Act, it's a federal law, says that no state can adopt a law that interferes with trucking prices, routes, and services. We think it's pretty clear that that's what this does. It's not direct, it's indirect, but there's substantial Supreme Court precedent that says indirect impacts absolutely are still interference and apply, and that federal preemption would exist. What happened here, though, was that there's Ninth Circuit precedent saying this is a general labor law. The Borrello case, I won't get into the weeds, had that finding, and they followed that precedent to say, this doesn't directly impact trucking. It's a general labor law. It talks about whether you're an independent contractor or an employee. It doesn't regulate the truck's prices, routes, or services. And I think, as I mentioned and Matt mentioned, there's some factual issues on, well, maybe some carriers could get an exception of the business to business approach. We think that's very difficult. We thought this was fairly clear cut. I do think the Solicitor General's brief that was asked for by the Supreme Court that came in very late had some influence. And of course, our Supreme Court has been wrapped up in many, many controversial issues as of late. And I guess chose not to take on another one.
You know, I have to take a pause here and throw it over to you, Mark. You know, prior to your ascension as the head of CSCMP, you know, you were senior VP, big time company. You know, you're hearing all this uncertainty. What are your thoughts for shippers out there as they're processing this uncertainty?
Well, Mike, I talk about this quite a bit, no matter where I'm presenting or having conversations with our members and those who are part of CSCMP and the broader supply chain community. And that is, there's no time like the present to re-examine your capacity building within your supply chain. Competency and capability matter. Today, we're living in an environment where raw intelligence is more important than thinking strategically around what we're going to be and become 4 years from now. It's living in the environment of the last portion of 2022 and 2023. And when we talk about this kind of in a more enveloping way, it's about pain and fear. It's the fear of what's going to happen to me tomorrow and the pain of having to resolve something that I do not manage or control, or at least feel like I don't have my hands around it very well. And this is some of what Matt has alluded to. Peter's talked about it. The life of the unknown is more important to pay attention to today and navigate through that through critical partnerships and continuous learning. If you're on this call today and you, or at least you listen to it if you couldn't attend live, this is part of that learning environment that you have to live in. The whole idea around 70% of what you need to know is on the job, 20% coaching and 10% externally. If you're in supply chain, you live that model, I'm sorry, you're going to fail because things are changing in the dynamics and the pressure against you as a supply chain leader or a practitioner or one just entering, even an analyst. It doesn't matter where you are. You know, maintaining a level of competency and intelligence is very, very important. The partnerships you create or maybe have sustained over time, I'll just go out on a limb from a sourcing and procurement professional perspective. If you're living in the same paradigm of 3 bids, a selection, and their problem solved, and you haven't deepened your conversation with your most strategic suppliers around their own personal business vulnerabilities and how they could impact your business and making that part of the ongoing conversation. And if you're better at it, the transaction, the contractual obligations, you're going to lose. But also, if you are on top of that, you're in a place where you're garnering intelligence because you've cemented relationships that really matter. An investment in their business means an investment in yours and vice versa. It's winning together. It's shared value. It's not about who can get the most out of this and, you know, may the best person win. It's, you're not going to succeed today. So thinking
let me just offer what you said about garner intelligence. One of the reasons I've been a longstanding member of the league and CSCMP and another group, this is the type of stuff that impacts supply chains, and being a part of these groups is invaluable. I have a bunch of questions here. I don't mean to go right into this. Peter, John wanted to know the Journal of Commerce. And by the way, if you all aren't getting the Journal of Commerce, what are you thinking? That's all I'm going to say. It is a fabulous publication. And the TPM conference, that's not even paid advertising, Peter. I just believe in it. But John brought up the rosy statistic that today 29,000 IPI containers are waiting for a train. If ports continue to slow and less labor is being used, how do you avoid further disruptions?
Well, you don't. The problem with rail always is that the deeper that the rail network gets out of balance, the longer it takes to extract itself. The rail meltdowns were during the merger of BN and Santa Fe, of UP and SP, during the carve up of Conrail or the carve up of Conrail, led to the moratorium that was in place for many years on rail mergers, because the operational impact on the rails from the disruption stemming from those events was so severe, and it took so long to correct itself. That's kind of what we're looking at right now. So I think that those the numbers of IPI containers waiting at LA Long Beach has continued to grow. If you look at the chart, the dwell of regular containers, listen to me, but containers that are moving out via truck has gone up, but not by nearly as much as what's going on the rails. I think it's very clear that we have a very, very significant rail crisis that is upon us. I think Gene Soroka expressed that alarm very clearly within the past week. And the problem is that rail containers are not easily diverted to truck once they've arrived at the port. Operationally, they're scheduled, as it were, on the rails, and they're not easily diverted. So I think this is a very serious situation that is emerging right now.
Yeah, Peter, I just want to jump in, and I want to ask Matt as well, to both of you just chime in on this. And if you could give a brief answer, we do have a couple other questions before we wrap up at 11. And that is, as part of the contract being expired, the arbitration proceedings are no longer applicable. And that, if you just briefly say how that impacts operations. Matt, if you can say that's something that you're seeing happen right now at the ports. Peter, can you explain the impact of no arbitration?
Well, the OICT at Oakland was unable to call in the coast arbitrator to rule.
Who is the OICT? Who is the OICT?
It's the largest marine terminal at Oakland, and it was the first terminal that was impacted by the trucker strikes when the longshoremen wouldn't cross the picket. And during the contract being in effect, the terminal operator could call in the arbitrator, who could then rule on the spot that the actions by the dock workers, if that person believes it, constitute an illegal secondary boycott and send them back to work. But the grievance procedure is not in place anymore after the July 1 expiration of the prior contract.
Okay, Matt, your thoughts?
Well, I think Peter put it pretty clearly. I don't know what really else could be said by that. I mean, we don't try to get in between Longshore and the PMA. It's a dangerous place to be. We're all in this together, essentially. And, whatever happens relative to these trucker actions, we're trying to get the governor's office to get engaged in these discussions. So I know the federal government has been having conversations with their office and trying to come to some level of resolution. What that resolution looks like, we don't know yet. But as far as ILWU is concerned, they're going to make their own decisions, especially locally in Oakland. Oakland has a long, rich history and tradition of disruptions when it comes to social action. So we'll see how this pans out.
Okay, two other questions very briefly, Matt. With respect to, the ports imposing their container dwell fee, which they've been, LA and Long Beach, in my opinion, have been using it as a club that we could use but haven't used. Are you concerned, given the fact no chassis available, no storage available. Are you concerned about that detention, that fee coming into effect anytime in the foreseeable future?
Well, the fee that never was might never will be, right? But you had individual terminals who put their own cargo dwell fees in. So it didn't even need the Port of LA to, I guess, motivate these marine terminals to implementing their own. Right now, the talk has been about looking at if it does get instituted, it would be on the rail side of things. And as all of you guys on this call know, if you try to find the lines for some type of long container dwell, they're just going to turn around and bill it right back to the BCOs. So without a doubt, that threat has been, in their mind, a motivating factor for moving some of that 9+ day local truck cargo off the docks, but it remains to be seen. But again, that did not stop local marine terminals from implementing their own dwell fees.
Okay, real briefly, Karen, rapid fire here. Are you concerned about BCOs that use drayage companies that are not in compliance with AB5?
Well, I think on that question, it was getting at whether a shipper who hires an independent contractor themselves would have trouble under AB5. Any hiring entity operating in California, if you're not exempt, has to apply the AB5 test. I think prong B is not a problem for shippers. You got to look at prong C. If you have an exclusive arrangement with an independent contractor trucker, I'm not saying it's problematic. You got to analyze it if you're a shipper. You're not worried about prong B, it's prong C.
Nancy, with some other time, we want to basically also talk, maybe have in a future webcast, how and Karen Azra is going to help potentially on the detention and demurrage issue. Knit League took the lead on that and has done a spectacular job with National Retail Federation. One final thing, we know that Putin, the Chinese, and North Koreans attacked my computer here today. We witnessed that. We want to know, Gene asked, who is driving support of the AB5 law? I mean, how did the trucking industry get sucked into this, and who is supporting it?
I think Matt's in the best position on this, but there's a long history here. And if you remember the Ports Clean Truck program, where they tried to use environmental laws to get at the trucking industry and that failed, that was step one. This is probably step two, but Matt, you're closer to it.
So Matt,
from that first iteration of the Clean Air Action Plan is really what stemmed the tremendous amount of misclassification lawsuits that happened because motor carriers were leasing trucks back to owner operators who didn't want to be employees, or those operational decisions were made back then for good reason. Owner operators weren't able to go procure new equipment primarily because of lack of credit history. And so, of course, no good deed goes unpunished. And the few bad apples spoiled the whole bunch, where you had these misclassification suits that come out. And I can tell you, and again, being sensitive to the fact that we have operators who maintain union operations, who are Teamsters, I can tell you that if it's any indication that the International Brotherhood of Teamsters rode side by side all the way to the Supreme Court with the state of California against the California Trucking Association action, that would be where it comes from. This is a labor play. It always has been. Again, Lorena Gonzalez, who's now the head of the Labor Federation in Los Angeles, former assemblywoman who wrote this law, has tremendous ties to labor. And for those of you who might not know, California has had a rich legislative history of, I guess, kowtowing to labor might be a good way to put it. I'm not sure, but
let me just
out here.
Let me jump in. And if you're not following Peter on Twitter, you must follow Peter on Twitter. Peter, I rely on your Twitter feeds to provide stuff. The other aspect that I would just emphasize, with respect to the IBT, and the pushing of this, Jim had asked a question. The other states, we addressed that. Massachusetts, New Jersey, others, and Knit League is really tracking this, Jim. If we push this into the PRO Act, which most of you don't know anything about, it's Katie, bar the doors and find another job, because logistics ain't going to be the place to be. But having said that, let me wrap it up with just an admonition. Hopefully what you've taken away from the call today is the level of uncertainty and the things that Mark was pointing out from a shipper perspective. I'd like to have each one of you that's on the call, we got a lot of people here, write down a statement, whether now or after the call. If my logistics and supply chain area is important to me and my company, I will map my supply chain. I will stress test my supply chain. And I will create a written supply chain / transportation spend management plan that takes a look at the various relationships I could have or do have and how our company will manage in a sea of uncertainty. It's something that is critically important, as we do in other webcasts and stuff, talking about how this impacts inventory, cash conversion, sales, process, et cetera. This is really spectacular. We'll send out a rating. We'll send out a replay. And Mark from CSCMP and Nancy from NITLEAG and Peter, Karen, and Matt, I just want to say thank you for a dynamite webcast. Thank you very much for your time.